Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Us versus Them: Race, Crime, and Gentrification in Chicago Neighborhoods by Doering. Narrated by Christopher Douyard. Publisher's Note: in this audio edition, you will hear references to figures and tables present in the print and ebook formats of this book. 1. Introduction: The Battle Over Race, Crime, and Gentrification. On a balmy Sunday evening in the early summer of 2012, a group of white residents assembled at around 9 p.m. on a street corner in Rogers Park, a racially diverse neighborhood on Chicago's North Side. The residents were members of a positive loitering group, which meant that they regularly walked the neighborhood together in order to deter crime and to report suspicious behavior to the police. By holding these events, the positive loiterers, I will call them the Lakesiders, wanted to signal that the community in this neighborhood was vigilant and not going to tolerate street crime. For about a year, this largely residential area of 4-story apartment buildings had seen an increase in gang activity on the part of the gangster disciples. Several gang members had moved there and started dealing drugs from a unit on a rundown rental block and, occasionally, on nearby street corners. Because of a conflict with a different crew of gangster disciples from another part of the neighborhood, an uptick in shootings had occurred, and 2 people had been killed. After the shooting of one young black man, whom the police later identified as an innocent bystander, some residents had come together to form the Lakesiders. As usual, the first to arrive that night was Bob, a retired, working-class man in his mid-50s, bringing as always his dog, an aging Labrador. Bob had founded the group. He scheduled the events and maintained the group's email listserv. Bob had receding gray hair, which he wore short and gelled back, a mustache, and thin-rimmed glasses. The second to join was Howard, a chubby and slightly disheveled-looking man. Bob and Howard were currently not on speaking terms. At the loitering event the night before, Bob had harshly criticized Howard for splitting off from the group and following a man whom the positive loiterers suspected of being a gangster disciple in order to find out where he lived. Bob had complained that Howard's action had been too dangerous. Having locked up my rusty mountain bike at a pole, I greeted the men, and we waited for additional members in silence, punctuated by my occasional, unsuccessful efforts to start a conversation. Bob smoked a few cigarettes to pass the time. By around 9:30, the group was complete for the night, having reached the size of 12. It now consisted evenly of men and women, including younger and older residents. One woman was East Asian. The rest were white. In addition, for a part of the night, the Lakesiders received an escort of 2 police officers in a patrol car, because yesterday one young black man, another gang member according to the Lakesiders, had approached the positive loiterers to speak with them, which the group had interpreted as a threat. Those who had missed the event asked Bob to recount what had happened. Bob laconically repeated the conversation with a wry smile. The young man had asked what the positive loiterers were doing. Bob's reply? Nothing. Why the residents were watching him and his friends from across the street? Bob: because we can. And what Bob was writing on his notepad: just things. The young man had then returned to his friends. After Bob had finished the story, the positive loiterers started to move through the neighborhood. The police officers remained in their car. At sporadic intervals, they started the engine and caught up with the group. This specific night was unusually eventful, but it unfolded the same way the Lakesiders' positive loitering events generally did. Every so often, the Lakesiders came across a group of black adolescents who were hanging out, talking, laughing, or listening to music on their cell phone speakers. When the positive loiterers found such a group, they stopped across the street and watched them. After a short while, the young people then usually dispersed or walked away, Tonight, they certainly did so as soon as the police cruiser drove up. As the teenagers walked off, some of them complained, saying things like, "I'm not doing anything," or "I'm just walking," without clearly addressing anyone in particular. That night, the positive loiterers had proceeded this way for about an hour and a half when the police officers left for the evening. But at around 11, the positive loiterers encountered yet another group of young black residents who were standing in front of a church building. To me, the 3 men and 2 women in their late teens or early 20s looked like they were dressed to go out, perhaps to a club. They were engrossed in conversation and did not notice us at first. The Lakesiders lined up under a row of shady trees while their targets stood across the street in the open under a streetlight. For 2 or 3 minutes, the young people ignored the positive loiterers and kept talking. But as the Lakesiders continued to scrutinize them, they began to look over. After a couple of minutes, one of the men walked up to the curb on his side of the street and started to shout at the positive loiterers, "Trayvon Martin! Trayvon Martin! Trayvon Martin!" His voice increased in volume and assertiveness as he repeated the exclamation. He then turned on his heels and walked back to his friends, who cheered him and exchanged high fives. They demonstratively resumed their conversation, making it a point to ignore the Lakesiders from then on. By this evening in the summer of 2012, the death of Trayvon Martin at the hands of a neighborhood watch volunteer in Sanford, Florida, had already become a national flashpoint, a tragic icon for the harassment and violence Black Americans are experiencing under the guise of crime fighting. In shouting Trayvon Martin, the speaker was able to situate the encounter with the Lakesiders in this political context and, by extension, accuse the positive loiterers of racism. The Lakesiders, however, did not respond to this racial challenge and continued to watch for another minute. Finally, they quietly walked off and relocated to a different street corner 2 blocks away. I asked Bob why he had left the prior corner. I saw that the other positive loiterers listened with interest. Bob replied, "They weren't going to move. They were digging in their heels." Despite the event's obvious emotional intensity, no one else commented on the incident. Soon, the Lakesiders decided to quit for the evening, and everyone went home. In an email to the members of the listserv, which Bob sent the next day, he reported that the Lakesiders had successfully dispersed several groups of bangers until a final group had tried to provoke the positive loiterers. He commented, "I am very proud of the group's lack of response so that it did not feed the situation." But the racial challenge that the young man had leveled at the Lakesiders in shouting Trayvon Martin was never discussed. Between 2011 and 2014, I studied the politics of crime and race in Rogers Park and Uptown, 2 racially integrated neighborhoods on Chicago's far north side. The confrontation between the Lakesiders and the group of black teenagers I just described represents one specific instance of a more general community conflict I observed in settings ranging from street corners to electoral campaign debates. Many residents regarded the fight against gang activity, shootings, and drug dealing as the most important local issue that had to be addressed in Rogers Park and Uptown. Like the Lakesiders, some became actively involved in public safety initiatives. They attended community policing meetings that enabled them to discuss local problems with police officers and shape the police's priorities and strategies. They joined or formed block clubs that monitored crime and disorder and also sought to influence local development decisions. And they participated in positive loitering events to reclaim public space. They also lobbied for more police officers, and they called on the city to go after problem buildings and problem businesses they suspected of abetting criminal activity. Others were less concerned about crime than the displacement and marginalization of low-income and minority renters. These residents argued that the real question Rogers Park and Uptown were facing was not how to reduce crime, but how neighborhoods could remain racially and socioeconomically diverse in the face of gentrification, which was slowly increasing the ranks of middle-class whites at the expense of low-income Black, Latino, and immigrant residents. In highly segregated Chicago, these residents felt these rare, integrated spaces had to be protected, especially on the prosperous North Side, where nearby neighborhoods, such as Lincoln Park and Lakeview, were already prohibitively expensive. As far as crime was concerned, any interventions needed to target root causes, poverty, unemployment, underfunded schools, and bad housing conditions, without making life harder for low-income residents. These competing views divided locally involved residents into two camps. Following the activists' self-descriptions, I call them the public safety and social justice camps. Each camp's members exhibited quite a bit of hostility and distrust toward the other, and there was very little overlap in membership. As Eric, a middle-aged public safety activist from Uptown, said, "There is an us versus them. People in subsidized housing look at safety initiatives as, the evil condo owners teaming up, trying to get rid of everybody and gentrify the neighborhood." This perception of us versus them reached deeply through the two neighborhoods and occasionally erupted as full-blown conflict between neighbors, community organizations, and candidates for public office. Many of those opposing gentrification were convinced that public safety activism, at least in the form in which it was conducted in Rogers Park and Uptown, did not make anyone safer, and was not even intended to do so. Instead, they portrayed safety initiatives as barely covert racist practices. The actual goal, they charged, was to intimidate, incarcerate, or simply displace Black, Latino, and low-income residents so as to fulfill hopes of increasing home values and rents that would match those already found in the surrounding highly gentrified areas. Social justice activists thus regarded public safety initiatives with scorn and sometimes directly attacked them. Due to their particularly belligerent practices, the Lakesiders, whom I will describe in more detail in Chapter 6, drew more attributions of racism than other groups, but justice activists regarded most public safety initiatives as racially suspect. By contrast, public safety activists and their organizational and political allies argued that all law-abiding citizens, including African Americans, Latinos, and immigrants, deserved to be safe. Block clubs, positive loitering groups, and community policing meetings were not about racially targeting residents or fostering gentrification, but about reducing crime and ridding the neighborhoods of incorrigible, dangerous offenders. Unlike the Lakesiders, some safety activists engaged their critics and took proactive steps to demonstrate that their efforts were not rooted in racial animus or fears. But others complained that social justice activists were simply harping on race because it allowed them to discredit their opponents. The hosts of Uptown Update, for example, a blog that reported and commented on crime in that neighborhood, became so infuriated by charges of racism in the blog's comment sections that they explicitly forbade such charges and pledged to delete any entries that contained them. This book provides a detailed analysis of community conflicts about crime, race, and gentrification. In doing so, it makes two broad contributions to the state of sociological knowledge and theorizing. First, it contributes to research on the link between crime and gentrification, showing how anti-crime initiatives can amplify gentrification and contribute to the marginalization of low-income, Black, and Latino residents. Second, the book closely traces how individuals and organizations invoke race as they negotiate the politics of crime and gentrification. Analyzing Rogers Park and Uptown as arenas for the making of racial claims, I will examine the ways residents, activists, and politicians tried to influence the direction of neighborhood change by strategically deploying racial meanings, discrediting an intervention as racially divisive, charging an opponent with racism, defending a particular initiative as racially benign, and so on. As I will show, These struggles over racial meanings shaped important local outcomes. But before elaborating on these points, I must first establish some historical and structural context about the links between race, crime, and residential integration. These links are by no means unique to Rogers Park and Uptown, but are essential aspects of the racial order of the United States. Race, crime, and racial integration. Crime and punishment have left a durable spatial mark on American cities and suburbs. At least since W.E.B. Du Bois's classic study of Philadelphia's black community, scholars have noted how whites' exaggerated fears of black crime have served to justify racial segregation, forcing African Americans into undesirable and underserved neighborhoods. After World War II, the issue of crime became even more pivotal for America's urban structure, as whites moved to the suburbs in part to flee from the perceived lawlessness of the growing black population. African Americans were left behind in segregated neighborhoods, deprived of services and resources. With the decline of urban manufacturing, many of these neighborhoods slipped by the late 1970s into severely concentrated poverty, from which many have not recovered to this day. Segregated and high-poverty neighborhoods lack both realistic opportunities for upward social mobility and the resources and collective efficacy needed to prevent crime. In these environments, hopelessness and alienation allow risky behavior and crime to thrive. All of these problems are directly linked to racial segregation. On the basis of an ambitious study of crime and inequality in American neighborhoods, Lauren Crevo and Ruth Peterson concluded that the combination of racial segregation and poverty is largely responsible for the dramatic inequalities in crime, particularly violent crime, that exist across urban neighborhoods. The criminal justice systems focus on punishment rather than prevention and rehabilitation, further destabilizes black neighborhoods. Over the last 2 decades, social scientists have assembled a vast scholarly literature that overwhelmingly demonstrates the negative effects of incessant police stops, institutional surveillance, and harsh punishment, especially on African Americans. These harmful impacts continue to gain visibility and prominence in black politics. Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, which identifies the criminal justice system as the heart of racial oppression in the post-civil rights era, has become a national bestseller. The nationwide social movement Black Lives Matter has emerged in response to high-profile cases of vigilantism and police brutality. Time and time again, cases like Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, and Laquan McDonald rattle the nation. It is not surprising that many African Americans distrust the police, perceiving them not as a provider of security, but as a hostile force that harasses, discriminates, and marginalizes. Since racial segregation reproduces poverty and crime in black neighborhoods, residential integration could conceivably alleviate both of these problems. There are some reasons for optimism in this regard. As scholars like Patrick Sharkey and Franklin Zimring have shown, crime has fallen dramatically in America's cities since its peak in the 1990s, although the neighborhood distribution of crime remains highly uneven. In principle, the general decline in crime means that white resistance against integration could soften. However, perceptions of black criminality remain deeply ingrained in American culture, complicating residential integration. Many whites continue to shun neighborhoods with sizable black populations and oppose measures that might contribute to desegregation, such as the construction of affordable housing in largely white neighborhoods. Aggregate measures of racial segregation are declining, which has led the economists Edward Glaser and Jacob Vigdor to declare the end of the segregated century. But this trend reflects a steady influx of immigrants into urban neighborhoods, more than increasing acceptance of black-white integration among whites. Thus, while racial segregation has decreased since the 1960s, black-white segregation in particular remains high. Against this background, it makes sense that crime would be a volatile topic in racially heterogeneous neighborhoods like Rogers Park and Uptown. From the perspective of most whites, low crime is the sine qua non of residential integration. Whites tend to feel unsafe and systematically overestimate crime rates in black and integrated neighborhoods. Both empirical studies and general theories of race and racism, such as the works of Lawrence Bobo and Eduardo Bonilla Silva, suggest that whites' limited tolerance for racial integration hinges on keeping a tight lid on crime. African Americans, on the other hand, often appreciate the superior conditions that integrated neighborhoods typically offer over segregated ones. But they can feel aggravated by the selective focus on black street crime that the police and their white neighbors tend to exhibit, as well as whites' inability or unwillingness to distinguish between the majority of the law-abiding black residents and the minority of criminal ones. Indeed, the confrontation between the Lakesiders and the group of young black residents I've described illustrates just this type of conflict. It is therefore easy to imagine that the issue of crime could divide entire neighborhoods along racial lines. This potential for conflict is by no means limited to Rogers Park and Uptown. Without focusing on this particular issue, studies of diverse or gentrifying neighborhoods, including books by Lance Freeman and Evelyn Perry, pinpoint crime as one major area of contention. Related stories can also be found in the news media. A 2017 piece in The Atlantic describes tensions over policing and surveillance in Brooklyn, concluding that gentrification and aggressive policing are two sides of the same coin. Furthermore, many of the recently publicized cases of whites calling the police to request interventions in response to black people engaging in lawful and mundane behaviors, like sitting in a coffee shop, barbecuing, or using a swimming pool, reveal a potent sense of threats whites experience in racially heterogeneous environments. Whites' fear of black crime aggravates racial division. At the same time, a smaller set of studies suggests that the fight against crime could produce the opposite outcome and actually coalesce urbanites of all backgrounds into strong communities. On the neighborhood level, blacks and whites have incentives to work together to ensure low crime, even if they disagree about larger questions of racial justice. Safety is a public good that all law-abiding residents need and want. According to George Kelling and Catherine Coles, the main exponents of broken windows theory, public safety work does not divide rich from poor, black from white, or one ethnic group from another. Instead, it unites diverse neighborhoods against those who behave in outrageous ways. Neighbors collaborating in grassroots initiatives, such as positive loitering groups or block clubs, could build trust and relationships across racial boundaries. In support of this claim, some studies have shown that anti-crime initiatives can indeed strengthen the fabric of racially heterogeneous neighborhoods. These conflicting perspectives served as the initial puzzle that led me to study crime and race in Rogers Park and Uptown. I wanted to understand whether crime would unite or divide residents across racial lines. But very soon, it became clear that this question was the wrong one, because it assumed that there was one correct answer, that black and white people formed cohesive political blocs that were either at peace or at war. Instead, I found both conflict and cooperation. In the public safety camp, whites strongly preponderated, but I also encountered African American safety activists. The latter did not at all agree that fighting crime had anything to do with race or racism. Among the social justice activists, there were certainly more African Americans, but also many whites. And of all the confrontations about the racial implications of fighting crime that I observed, most actually involved whites struggling with other whites. The political lines of alliance and opposition were thus too complex to fit my initial question. As a result, I shifted my attention from the politics of racial groups to the politics of racial claims-making. How and when did specific actors invoke race? What could they hope to accomplish in doing so? What strategic value did specific racial narratives have? Asking these questions, I used Rogers Park and Uptown as sites for a fine-grained study of racial politics and its impact on the urban environment. As political microcosms, which exhibit partly independent political dynamics and feature a manageable set of relevant actors, these integrated neighborhoods afforded an excellent opportunity to do so. Following this approach provided much more interesting insights into the racial politics and urban change than my initial question could have allowed. Studying the politics of crime and race in Rogers Park and Uptown. To examine the politics of crime and race, I conducted 3.5 years of ethnographic fieldwork in Rogers Park and Uptown between the summer of 2011 and the spring of 2014. Rogers Park and Uptown are located along the lakefront of Lake Michigan on Chicago's far north side. Given that Chicago remains one of the most segregated cities in the United States, the two neighborhoods represent anomalies. In 2010, 27 and 20% of Rogers Parkers and Uptowners, respectively, identified as Black or African American, 25 and 13% as Latino, and 38 and 52% as non-Hispanic white. These neighborhood demographics reflect more closely than most neighborhoods the overall composition of Chicago, in which each of three groups, African Americans, Latinos, and whites, constitutes about 30% of the population. In this sense, it is accurate to call Rogers Park and Uptown integrated. This is not to say that at the time of my fieldwork all aspects of community life in these neighborhoods reflected their racial diversity. Echoing findings from other studies of integrated neighborhoods, I found that specific establishments and spaces frequently revealed microsegregation. For example, only a handful of non-Hispanic whites attended the local high schools, despite the fact that they were the largest population group in both neighborhoods. Neither does integrated mean that residence networks were necessarily racially diverse. In speaking of integration, I mean to communicate only that residents lived close to members of other ethno-racial groups, and thus had to engage or actively avoid one another in public life. There were strategic and methodological advantages to studying Rogers Park and Uptown. Their proximity made it possible for me to conduct fieldwork in both neighborhoods at the same time, regularly going back and forth between them on the same day of fieldwork. Studying two neighborhoods increased the sheer number of opportunities for observing community events and identifying interviewees from rare populations, such as Black safety activists. Having access to two neighborhood contexts also provided useful analytic and interpretive leverage for understanding each case better. Rogers Park and Uptown resemble each other in terms of their socio-demographic composition, crime rates, and vibrant traditions of community activism. Their match along these dimensions, all of which are central to the study, allowed me to compare how the politics of crime and race diverged or converged in similar environments. In this process of contextualizing the findings, I could build not only on my own data, but also on several accounts of community life and politics other scholars have published over the years. In order to study how residents negotiated the racial implications of fighting street crime, I observed positive loitering events, block club and community policing meetings, anti-gentrification protests, aldermanic town halls, and much more. I listened as social justice activists rehearsed protest songs on the way to picketing the home of a wealthy developer. I heard exasperated residents tell stories about notorious offenders who had accumulated hundreds of arrests. I witnessed Black teenagers describe volatile police encounters at a racial justice book club. I helped block club members pick up trash while discussing the causes of crime. In this way, I created an extensive set of field notes. I also conducted interviews with 78 African Americans, whites, Asians, Latinos, and Africans of all ages and backgrounds. Furthermore, I gathered a sizable corpus of newspaper articles, blog posts, electoral campaign flyers, organizational documents, and secondary data, such as crime and census statistics. Together, These data create a richly detailed portrait of local politics and
Sample complete. Ready to continue?